Hi, welcome to the channel. Welcome back if you're a current subscriber. Today I'm doing another body language analysis on another interviewer, Gypsy Roses, this time with a woman named Kale. This video comes, however, from a channel called Straight Out of Context. Again, I'll try to leave the link of her channel in the description box, so please go check that out. Let's get into it.
In the book, you talk about the correctional facility that you were at. Does the word correctional in the name of a prison mean anything?
I think that it does. I think that the word correction often means to stop or to prevent, and prison definitely does that.
So you think
So right off the bat, we're seeing her emphasize with her eyebrows. I think that it does, along with what she looks like when she's data collecting, when she's thinking, does it not? We see a little bit of a referential distancing, and we see clasped hands. That clasped hands being a sign that she might be nervous. This is an interview, so it's possible it's because of that, but she's not open with her answer. She's not as confident with her answer as she could be.
what does that even mean? And when you say that you were trying foods for the first time, what were some of the things that you experienced with eating certain foods for the first time?
So when I say eating certain foods for the first time, it means that I've never tried it before.
Okay.
So certain foods my mother never let me eat, or the majority of my nutrition came from my feeding tube,
Right.
and formula based nutrition.
All the way up until
So a few things to note here. First of all, her blink rate almost does not exist. She's very focused. This can indicate deception because our blink rate, while it may increase when we're being deceptive because we're stressed out, because we're saying something we should not be, it can also go the opposite way where we're so focused on the reaction of the other individual we're talking to because we're saying something that can merit a reaction in a big way, or we're trying to figure out, do I continue with this particular narrative or not? So this is possibly what's going on. I'm not going to say guaranteed because that's not absolute. But you see her close off a bit and then some adjusters. Now, there was controversy over whether she was adjusting a pillow because she was supposed to be pregnant at this time. And it's possible she was adjusting a pillow that she had under her shirt, but just that she is adjusting, that she is uncomfortable, that she's not confident and open. As you saw, she even pulls back a little bit, creating a little bit of distance between herself and Kale here. All of this just says that there's not a lot of confidence in what she's saying, that she might be deceptive in this part because she's not as open and comfortable with what she's talking about.
so you were how old?
24. That was about time itself.
I did not realize that. So when you don't have those glands anymore, what does that do for eating food?
So the salivary glands isn't exactly part of why I had the feeding tube.
Okay.
So the salivary glands was taken out after the feeding tube was already placed in. But what your salivary glands do is produce saliva. So it's often you'll see.
We then see her go from saying, I did this up until I was 24, up until the crime. She's not looking at Kale, she's looking around, and this could be data collecting. This isn't an emotional telling of events. She's not looking down, which is something that we might expect to see in this part. Not always, but might expect to see in this part because it is about the removal of her salivary glands. I would assume that might be an emotional, potentially traumatic event for her, but instead we're seeing her data collect up here and her hands going from down to what that means is your, and then you see that referential shift as her palms open and she is more confident and open with what she's talking about. This all does indicate a bit of deception, as typically we don't have referential shift if we're talking about something that is pertaining to us. That referential shift, along with her palms going from down to out and open, more confident, she's less barriered, tells me that when referring to herself in this particular scenario, she might not have been honest. She also was not displaying some emotional signs that we would typically expect to see based on an event that could have been a bit traumatic.
In the book, you said that you were in a silent standoff, right? So your mom was desperate to sort of keep control over you. Looking back, do you still feel the same way?
I do.
Yeah.
I just feel a little bit more humanity towards her now. Because after going through all the research with family members, I started to learn that she seemed very self-isolated. She was just not someone that had a social life herself. It was very much keep us in a tiny bubble.
Do you think that that was...
Several things going on here as well. First of all, Gypsy does not have the eyebrow flash that you would expect to see, emphasizing the beginning of the statement where she's saying, I do still believe this. There's a bit of a lilt in her tone as she says, I see a bit more humanity in her, and her head tilts. This indicates a level of curiosity, of uncertainty, of interest, just not a confidence in what she's saying, and then a bit of what's called fading facts when she starts to talk about doing research with her family. And you see, again, a bit of distancing she puts between herself and Kale, and all of that indicates, again, that she's not fully confident in what she's saying, that perhaps part of her knows she should not be discussing this, and the bit that turns into a question is, I saw a bit of humanity in her. This indicates potentially that there was a part of her that did not see her mother as a human. Now, this is something I would expect typically from psychopaths. I would expect to see that from someone who has psychopathy, because typically they see someone as just a tool, a resource, or in their way, not someone with humanity. That, again, is not a guarantee here, but based on the crime that Gypsy committed that matches up here, that potentially she has antisocial personality disorder. Again, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I cannot diagnose her, but there are a lot of indicators that she does have antisocial personality disorder, and this is very much one of them. Her speaking about her mother, who is no longer around, with a lack of emotion or remorse, sadness, of guilt, no indications of that, along with saying that she sees a bit more humanity, indicating that she hadn't prior, and then at the same time making that a question as if she's not even certain that she does see humanity in her mother, that she is seeking approval to even say this, and that along with her going from, again, open palms, openness, to drawing back, and she's adjusting again, and her hands are in her lap and down, not out and open and confident and comfortable. She also starts to talk about her mother's social life and saying that she learns her mother was isolated, which based on what we know is not necessarily true. I believe she was even in pageants or something along those lines. Let me know in the comment section if that is also what you heard or you heard something different. But based on what is out there, her mother actually wasn't a very isolated person, but Gypsy says she was an isolated person herself, and trying to lead Kale to believe that her mother was isolated and therefore Gypsy was also isolated, again, based on what we know now, is not true. Based on neighbors and friends' accounts and photos out there, Gypsy herself was not even isolated. She was parts of several groups, and even in the book itself, she states that she was doing Girl Scouts and other activities and things that we now know would mean that she was not in this complete bubble, completely isolated. There were even movie nights. And the indications body language wise that she is being deceptive here are that her head tilts, she's uncertain, distancing, she's not as open and confident about it. There's not emphatic eye flashes or forehead creases where they should be. And all of this combined tells me that she's being deceptive if I didn't know that already, based on verbally what she's saying in comparison to what we have seen in photos and from the accounts of friends and family.
Do you think that that was intentional and she was aware of it, or do you think it was more like she didn't really know that she was doing these things?
I think maybe both. And I have feelings about both. So, I mean, I think that it was intentional to not correspond with our family, not correspond with my father. And so I think that that part was intentional, but I don't think that maybe she was aware how that affected me in a negative way.
Okay. So maybe some of the other things that were happening were...
You see her physically illustrating, lining up what she's saying and emphasizing things with her hands here. From here to here, you could see what's past, what's present, and you see that even with her eye movements going up and then down this direction. A bit of an emotional recall there, but then verbally what she's telling us is, I don't believe that it was fully intentional. It was intentional to keep Gypsy from her family members, such as her father, but not intentional to hurt her. Again, this verbally is pretty telling based on what we know now, that she wants people to believe that her mother was a very abusive, violent, aggressive, horrible person. But here she is saying, well, she intentionally kept me from my father, but I don't believe her intent was to hurt me, that she realized that was negatively affecting me. All of that is a conflict in her usually larger narrative that her mother knew that she was intentionally trying to hurt Gypsy and that she was an awful person. Now, looking at other parts of that, it would make sense given Rod, Gypsy's father, and Dee Dee Blanchard did not want to interact frequently because they were divorced, because Rod had run off with Christy Blanchard, the now stepmother, it would make sense that her mother didn't want to keep in touch with Rod. However, in other conversations, Gypsy notes that she would try to talk to Rod and there Dee Dee would be, which would indicate a level of Gypsy had some interactions with her father. She was allowed those. Her mother would interfere, potentially because she felt it was unsafe or that she wanted to monitor what was being said. This is all speculation, of course, but I wanted to note just verbally what she is telling us is a contradiction in other things. And then body language-wise, you're seeing her illustrate and line up things, but verbally, things clash with what she has said otherwise.
If you had to guess, how many times do you think that you've been under anesthesia?
Probably over 100, probably.
And do you know what the side effects of that are? Like, do you have, I think I've read something about like short-term memory or long-term memory. Do you feel like you feel any side effects, long-term effects from it?
I haven't noticed any so far, which I feel like I'm blessed for that.
For sure.
Going under anesthesia,
Just real quick, I want to note that, of course, when she's asked how many times she has been under anesthesia, then Gypsy starts to rub her hands, and you see her voice fade. Again, what's called fading facts, where she knows that she's not supposed to be saying this. She says, over 100, she's not certain about this. This indicates a level of deception with the rubbing of the hands and the lowering of the voice. Not certainty in this at the very least. There's also that stop gesture when she says, which I feel like I'm blessed with that, but you see a lot of shrugging of the shoulders, just again, not confidence, not certainty, not emphasis where it should be, no illustrators, her hands are off the table in her lap. So all of this is just a level of uncertainty and lack of confidence in what she's telling Kale.
When I was a kid, I didn't ask questions.
Right.
So it's like all the side effects and everything, all the dangers, was told to my mom, not to me.
Right. Agreed, because you were a minor. So that makes sense. In the book too, you talked about your, I don't want to call it an addiction because I don't necessarily think that you called it an addiction. Do you think that you had an addiction?
I absolutely do think that it was an addiction, to painkillers.
Yeah.
Yes.
So by accident, or did you
So then she goes on to tell Kale that since she was a kid, her mother was told the side effects, which does not necessarily directly answer whether she had side effects. She, of course, says, I haven't noticed any, but then she says, I was a kid, so all of the side effects were told to my mother. Of course, most people know that as a child, even your mother has to be in the room, your father has to be in the room, some adult has to be in the room, but they are in the room with you, and usually you do hear the list of side effects, even if those are stated to the parent, the adult, which would make sense to do. And Kale even says that makes sense, although we know that Gypsy's intentions here are most likely to make it seem as if this is just another part of how Gypsy had no control over her life, but her mother did have control over her life. And based on what we know now, most likely her intentions were to play up her mother was allegedly a harmful individual in full control and oppressing her in some manner. But Kale goes on to state that, well, that makes sense, you're a minor. Now, do you think it was an addiction? There was an addiction. And Gypsy says, I do think it was an addiction. And you see some eyebrow flashes which do emphasize things, however. Then Kale asks if it was an addiction, states that Gypsy did not call it addiction herself prior to this. And then Gypsy questions at the end to painkillers, indicating is that what he mean? Most likely she should know what Kale is discussing there, an addiction to what else could she be referring to? Again, just a lack of confidence in what she's saying in this part, a lot of shoulder shrugging, a lot of pulling back, distancing herself a bit from Kale here.
So by accident, or did you were you already taking them and you felt the effects, and so you eventually got to a point where you were abusing them, or do you think that it was more by accident?
It was originally my first exposure was from pain medication from after having surgery,
Right.
and so that was accidental. So it started off with, okay, they prescribed me this pain medicine. Oh, it makes me feel different. It makes me feel kind of numb. And so after that point, that's when I slowly started to take more and more and more and slowly abused it.
Okay. And your mom was aware of it. They didn't say anything.
Correct.
Because
A ton going on here. So she starts off with a bit of a grimace there as she's saying it started off originally a bit accidental. And you see a grimace there which indicates a disapproval, dislike, just not something she necessarily wants to talk about. Now in other interviews, such as her Today Show interview, she stated that it's difficult to talk about these things. So it's possible that we're seeing that grimace come up a bit there because of that, because she doesn't like talking about this alleged addiction. However, it could also indicate that she didn't have an addiction, or that she knows that this is not something she should be talking about for some reason. But then she goes into what's basically asymmetrical with her body, one hand under the table and down and still, while the other part of her body comes up, and she starts illustrating and emphasizing a bit with that one hand. And then when she starts discussing, well, once I was under anesthesia, it made me feel different, her other hand comes up and you see a more symmetrical bit of body language there, indicating more honesty and openness and confidence in what she's saying. Prior to that, however, she says, and then Kale says, oh, so your mother knew about this and didn't say anything. Gypsy very confidently, chin jutted out, head up, says, correct. And she says it very strongly. And this part, again, was interesting to me because if her mother was oppressive, she would have most likely not allowed this amount of addiction. She would have controlled that in some manner. So I believe that is also contributing to part of why Gypsy doesn't want to say anything about this in the first place. Again, we're not seeing any body language indicating any amount of sadness, despite her mother being no longer alive. And she's very actively talking about some really negative parts about her mother, very confidently, when it comes up that her mother might be a bad person, things that might lead people to believe her mother was a bad person. She's very confident about those parts. When it comes to Gypsy's own potential flaws, Gypsy is a little more withdrawn and a little more distanced, not as confident, not as certain about things. And what we should be seeing is some form of sadness, some form of grief, some grief muscles furrowing, some negative tonality here, instead of everything that we are actually seeing.
I know at one point you talked about how you took the last of your mom's pills, and then you guys had to go file a police report in order to get a refill because that was the only way that you could get a refill on the narcotics.
Correct.
When you think about that now, how do you feel?
I mean, I definitely feel a lot of regret because that's, not behavior that I would ever condone or am proud of. But it does put it in perspective as to like what mind frame I was in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
So here you see a flash of contempt as she says she has some regrets, but then she says, because that's something I wouldn't want to do. She shakes her head. It's a bit dismissive of the situation. Again, there's not any indication really of her feeling that remorse and that regret. No grief muscles, no crease in the forehead, no furrowing of eyebrows, none of that. Not the vertical lines in the face. You don't see the underside of her pupils, which you would often see if someone were feeling any level of exhaustion or grief or remorse for anything. Again, you're just not sitting here surrounding this conversation, and we would expect to see that. So that indicates a level of her being deceptive, her not necessarily telling him the truth, and that along with the clasped hands, a bit of a barrier between herself and Kale, not confidence and openness that you see in other parts of this.
I would be so curious to know, if she was here today, like where her mind was at in that moment. Because did she need them at that point, or do you think
she did need them? We were in a car accident in 2001, and it left her with an injured leg.
Okay.
And her leg had never healed back fully.
Right.
So she still had like the pins and screws and plates and hardware to kind of keep her leg in place. And she suffered from daily pain. I won't say that she abused them.
That was my next question. Okay.
She didn't abuse them.
So there's a lot of barriering going on here, putting something in between herself and Kale, and that is her arm. And you see a little more asymmetrical body language here. All of this, again, not as open about it. You don't see emphasis behaviors where there should be. She is asymmetrical in her body language and also very closed off, which someone would typically be if they were defensive. So it's interesting to see here because her tone is not that of someone who's defensive, but of someone who is uncertain. This is not something that necessarily speaks to a poor character from Dee Dee Blanchard, Gypsy's mother. So I believe this contributes to Gypsy being closed off here. And again, not seeing the grief muscles, not seeing remorse or regret, any sadness, a bit of defensiveness and barriering. As she talks about this, some uncertainty, and perhaps this is not what took place at all.
In the book, I was shocked to find out that Christy and Dee Dee knew each other.
Yes.
Before your dad and Christy were together.
Yes. Laura, Christy, and my mom all knew each other.
That is so interesting. So was that a point of contention? I believe I read in the book that it was a point of contention. Dee Dee felt like Christy sort of took her place and was with your dad. Is that right?
Correct.
So your dad and Christy actually grew up together.
Yeah, they met in high school. So, it was a small town.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like everybody knows everybody. So yeah, they kind of grew up together and went to school together and stuff like this. So they were always friends.
I do want to note real quick the positive tonality in all of this as Gypsy's describing Rod and Christy Blanchard's, Gypsy's now stepmother's, friendship. Now there is a bit of a bearing and clasping of hands there, but not as much. She's a little more open, honest, confident. Her tonality is positive. There's an uplifting of features, all positive tonality when discussing Christy and Rod. While they were still friends, and her narrative here is that it was a small town, and this is a setup for what she's about to say in regards to the situation where Christy was allegedly trying to be more than friends with Rod, but we'll get into that. Gypsy's noting it's a small town, so everyone sort of knew each other, therefore it would make sense that they had become friends. And in a way, verbally, this speaks to Dee Dee potentially being this bad person. This just adds a little bit more to that. But you see a lot of uplifting of features, no furring, no drooping of anything. So positive tonality, she's very happy to be talking about Christy and Rod.
And when my dad started dating my mom, Christy was still just a friend. But my mom always felt like there was maybe something more. And that jealousy kind of grew from there, and there was always contention between the two.
Did you know that before writing the book?
You see a bit of open and honesty, a bit more confidence here. There's a bit of a mouth shrug, though, when she says they're always just friends. There's this lack of harmony in what she's saying as she bends over this direction, but she's saying they're friends. This just offers a disconnect in the situation, this lack of harmony between herself and the situation or this person. And then it goes back into confidently and openly saying, this is what took place. They're just friends. And she offers up that Dee Dee was jealous. Again, not something you would expect to hear from someone discussing their mother, especially who is no longer alive, and a huge lack of remorse or grief around this situation. Just a contribution to how Dee Dee is allegedly a bad person. This is a very long one again, so I'm going to end this here. I will post a part 2 very soon. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section if you've watched this far. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Thank you.